damos la bienvenida a este encuentro en el ciclo de conferencias internacionales, las colecciones bibliográficas especiales, diferentes miradas, organizada por la Biblioteca Nacional Mariano Moreno y auspiciada por la Asociación Internacional para la Protección del Patrimonio Cultural, ASIMPAC. En esta oportunidad agradecemos la generosa presencia de los doctores Robert Darnton y Michael Suarez. Las conferencias que van a ver ahora fueron grabadas con anterioridad para asegurar su correcta reproducción. Durante el desarrollo de la exposición y al final, los autores estarán presentes por el chat. Las exposiciones de hoy se encuadran dentro de lo que son un estudio de las colecciones especiales en bibliotecas del mundo y específicamente América y Europa. Tengo el gran honor de presentar la primera conferencia de Michael Suarez, director de la Rare Book School de la Universidad de Virginia, profesor universitario y curador de colecciones especiales, quien fue nombrado para el Consejo Nacional de Humanidades por el presidente Obama en 2015 y quien participó en la Leal Readership en Bibliografía de la Universidad de Oxford, presidente del capítulo Pi Beta Kappa de la Universidad de Virginia entre 2015 y 2019 y quien ha recibido numerosos premios, entre los cuales el premio Fredson Bowers de la Sociedad Bibliográfica de América en 2014, el premio anual de la American Printing History Association en el 2012, por una contribución distinguida al estudio, registro, preservación y difusión de la historia de la impresión. También ha beneficiado de numerosas becas de investigación, entre las cuales cabe destacar la Biblioteca Folger Shakespeare, el Instituto Radcliffe para Estudios Avanzados, la Universidad de Harvard, el Fondo Nacional para las Humanidades, la Sociedad Bibliográfica de Londres, la Biblioteca Lewis Walpole, la Universidad de Yale, la Sociedad Bibliográfica de América y otras. Es además editor y coeditor de numerosos libros. Michael, if you want speak now.
Sure, thank you, Susana. I'm very privileged to be here and to talk to you a little bit about some of the major trends that are happening in special collections libraries in the United States today. One of the most important things, I think, is that even before the Black Lives Matter movement that is so important in the United States right now, libraries have been thinking a lot about new publics, thinking much more about what communities they might be able to serve and less about what treasures they might hold. So the priorities are shifting, generally speaking, from collections, from stuff, if you will, to services. And obviously, digitization and technological advancement is important, but there's an increasing focus on access. For whom do we hold these materials? There's an increasing focus on public-facing programming, and there's an increasing focus, I think, on bridge building to communities. Obviously, a lot of this is tied up with the questions of equity and diversity and inclusion that's driving new acquisition policies as well, and I'll get to that in a little bit. But I think that generally speaking, special collections libraries in America, particularly those that are tied to elite universities, are asking themselves questions about for whom do we hold these materials? And are these materials, these so-called treasures, which indeed they are, only for cultural elites? Or are there ways of mediating them to broader publics so that more people can understand about the riches of their heritage? One of the big trends within this that I see all over the United States is a phenomenon that we might call community curation. A working with local groups, forming local partnerships with Black communities and maybe especially with immigrant communities, so that the stories that haven't been part of special collections can be told. A lot of this then is about building trust in these communities between the special collections personnel and the local leaders of those communities, and to say, you have important materials that tell the story of your people, that tell the story of part of the United States that's not often told. That could be Laotian and Cambodian, or it could be African American. That could be any number of the Latino immigrant communities that have come to the United States. But how could we document those stories better? And how could we say that the local special collections is a good repository for some of your family and community archive, but also how could we say that we need you to be a partner with us in figuring out what these material objects mean and how they belong once you put them in special collections, not to the university to keep separate, but how do they belong to everyone? How are we going to find a way to tell powerful stories with these objects? So a good example would be a number of special collections libraries are trying right now to recover the story of the Black veterans who served in the Second World War. The photographic archive of that experience is often very rich, and those are often treasures of individual families. But how could we make those publicly accessible? Maybe through digitization. How could we create, in the case of maybe more recent veterans, oral archives, oral histories, in such a way that we could tell the story of Black American veterans. Another important thing that's a kind of a pet project of mine is this question of community newspapers. Nobody 10 years ago collected community newspapers at all. But these newspapers in probably about 160 different languages in the United States document the story, the ongoing and evolving story of immigrant communities. So how could we think about special collections more as a partner to collect local stories and to collect and safeguard regional histories, not to lock them away, but to have the resources to help bring them alive. That kind of regional and culturally relevant information for many American universities and local special collections libraries is helping them think better about the voices of underrepresented communities, and to help the work that universities and research groups do to think about more inclusive research and more inclusive learning. Related to that, in the United States, there's a real problem, and that is that special collections librarians make up about 87% of all the librarians. The white librarians make up about 87% of all the librarians in special collections. And in the United States, the retention rate among people who go into special collections who are Black and Hispanic is shockingly low, less than 50%. There haven't traditionally been very good career opportunities, and there hasn't traditionally been very good professional training. So now, one of the things that's happening in American special collections libraries is to create pipeline programs, to create programs to help special collections library staff look more like America, to have more Asian, Hispanic, and Black and Indigenous people working on collections, so that when students and members of the public come in, they feel like they belong there, instead of this being a domain of only white cultural elites. That's going to be a long process, but I think that many universities and many private libraries are very committed to that project, not just of changing what the relationship with the local community is, but also changing who the personnel on the ground are who are mediating the stories. Another development is in collection use and what actually is collected. Partly due to my good friend and mentor, Bob Darnton, who we'll hear from in a little bit, and Roger Chartier, who's also been part of this series, and a host of others. Book history has really come to the fore in the humanities in America. Many people in literature departments of various kind and in history departments are practicing book history. And that's really given people a greater hunger for the object. And what we're finding is the more that special collections libraries display their objects digitally, the more actual physical use they have. Will Knoll, who was a librarian at the Walters Library, always used to say that his vocation was to give it away on the web, to give away priceless manuscripts on the web where you could give them, and then people would want to come in and work on them in important scholarly ways. So that to use the digitization process as a kind of broadcast advertisement for the materials that particular collections hold. And that's been really important. I know Richard Ovenden, the great librarian at the Bodleian Library, has said that the studies in Bodley have shown that the more they put physical collections up on the web, the more individuals want to come in and study those materials physically. Partly because bibliography and book history has helped people to understand the legibility of those objects and to derive more information from the encounter with the physical object than they could just get from the two-dimensional object online. It's also true that special collections has become more and more a kind of node for people to access particular digital resources, especially when licensing agreements prohibit outside users from being able to have access to those digitized collections. So as collections become more networked and as collections become more licensed, American special collections are finding that people come onto those sites, into the physical building, to be able to use resources that, unless they were members of the university, they couldn't otherwise use. So there's a tension. There's a tension in American libraries more generally, and certainly a tension in special collection between the spending of resources on physical objects, often that are very costly, and the spending of resources on digital collections, which typically now the model is one of renting, and so you're paying and paying and paying and paying. And special collections libraries are having a really hard time negotiating that pull in the two directions. They would like their collections to become more Catholic, lowercase c, more universal, more representative of diverse publics. And yet at the same time, they need to have a kind of a nexus of very high-end digital collections for the scholarly work that needs to happen typically in a university. The world of the journal package, the scholarly journal package, has made the lives of university administrators well nigh impossible because we need to have these scholarly journals, and yet they've become so expensive that they've taken over such a huge proportion of the library budget. There's an interesting study by the Ithaca Research Group in the United States that said that 50% of library directors in the United States said that they were very likely to cancel major journal packages in the next 5 years because they have so many other demands. And particularly that demand to reach out to the community and to have special collections not just be for the high end of research is really putting a strain on resources. As the scholarly record becomes more heterogeneous and more dynamic, containing more different kinds of material, it's proven really difficult for librarians to negotiate from among these competing goods. I myself, since 2010, have been part of a big digital edition called Oxford Scholarly Editions Online out of Oxford University Press. And when I go around the world talking to people and talk to them about OSEO, many people say, well, we really want to be part of this, but we can't afford to, which is one of the reasons why projects like the Digital Public Library of America, the DPLA, that Bob has been so instrumental in, have been really important. We need to think about access, and we need to think increasingly about access for whom and access to what. I think once upon a time we just said, oh, access, that's the desideratum, access and discovery. And now we're saying, well, what kind of access? How is digital access different than access to the physical object? What happens if the terrific things we have are all behind a paywall? What happens if local communities who have contributed to our collections in these partnerships find themselves blocked from using the full resources of the Special Collections Library? What if physical access is permitted, but when new publics enter the Special Collections Library, they find themselves in alien territory without people to help mediate the experience to them, and without seeing people who look like they do and who share common history with them. I'd say the third and final major trend that I'd just like to advert to briefly is that in the United States, special collections libraries have become and are becoming more and more centers of instruction. Many special collections libraries either have undergone renovation of late or are currently undergoing renovations. And almost invariably, those renovations include the building of more classrooms. Many special collections libraries were built without classrooms, just with a central reading room. but now we found that special collections is a central node of humanistic instruction, and that undergraduates are more and more being brought into special collections to do their own academic research, and that usually starts through guided experiences in the special collections library with curators. So it's become more and more important in the American special collections landscape that there are outreach librarians and that there are instructional librarians. The world of American special collections has become much more mapped onto the educational part of university work and not just the knowledge creation work. I think most special collections libraries were founded in service of knowledge creation and prestige, cultural prestige, if you will. And now more and more special collections libraries are thinking about how can we be absolutely germane to the core mission of the university, which is not only knowledge creation, but also teaching the youth of Athens, as it were. And so more and more special collections librarians are in partnerships with academics. More and more special collections librarians are co-teaching courses with full-time professors. More and more special collections librarians are hungering to get pedagogical training and are acquiring collections specifically for the purpose of teaching undergraduates. And so this is a really salutary trend in the United States, I think, and elsewhere, of course, in the world. But the fact that the special collections library is no longer forbidden to the undergraduate, but rather is part and parcel of a classroom experience that undergraduate student is having, is really important. I, as Susana said, am the director of a school for the study of rare books and manuscripts and digital materials at the University of Virginia. And we have about 500 people come every year from all over the world to Charlottesville, Virginia, and 15 partner institutions. And many of those people come and take classes not merely because they need to write a catalog if they're librarians, or not merely because they want to write a chapter for their book manuscript if they're professors, but because they want to teach a particular kind of collection to their students, because they want to learn about teaching book history hands-on in more bibliographically informed ways. I think one of the biggest shifts, and I'll end here, is that I think we thought once upon a time that the Special Collections Library was a sequestered, a partitioned domain, and now those doors have been thrown open. I taught my first undergraduate class in 1987, and I thought that one of the most important things I was trying to do was impart knowledge to my students. And I still think that's true, but I think now, because of the possibilities of the internet, students can travel across the world in the click of a pad, right? But what we can do when we take people into special collections, whether they're young or old, is to inculcate wonder. And I believe that special collections in America has increasingly gotten into the wonder business, not just to convey information about who Gutenberg was and how he ran his shop, but to get people excited about the objects that bear tremendous cultural meaning, and to use those as a kind of a wormhole or gateway into the past. To give people a profound instinct for human history, but first of all by making them touch and smell and feel those books, not in a fetishist way, but to use that as a hook to develop a deeper humanistic historical sensibility. So I think all that we're doing in many ways is in service of inculcating wonder in a variety of publics and of making the Special Collections Library, both in its materials and in its people, more accessible to a diverse community.
Great presentation. I have a lot of questions for you, but maybe we will wait the end of the both presentations to have a little series of questions, and you will have questions on the chat next time. Okay, so
Sure.
Tengo el agrado y el honor ahora de presentar la conferencia del profesor Robert Darnton. El profesor Darnton, nacido en la ciudad de Nueva York y egresado de la Universidad de Oxford, vinculado como su padre y su hermano al New York Times, y conocido sobre todo como profesor y director de la Biblioteca de la Universidad de Harvard desde el año 2007, miembro de la Academia Americana de Artes y de Ciencias, de la Sociedad Filosófica Americana, de la Sociedad Americana Anticuaria, de la Sociedad Histórica de Massachusetts, de la Academia Europea y entre otras instituciones. Ha participado, ha colaborado con numerosas revistas internacionales, entre ellas la Revue de Synthèse, la revista Historia de las Ciencias Humanas, la Wilson Quarterly, el Boletín de Historia Intelectual, la revista 18e siècle, la revista Historia Social del Libro y otras. También podemos mencionar los numerosos premios recibidos por Robert Darnton, entre ellos el Premio de Ensayo de la Sociedad Americana de Estudios del Siglo XVIII, el Premio Koren de la Sociedad de Estudios Históricos Franceses, el Premio Leo Gershoy de la American Historical Association, la beca MacArthur Prize, el Premio del Libro del Los Angeles Times, el Premio de Humanidades Beram de la Universidad de Princeton. Es caballero, chevalier y officier de la Orden de las Artes y de las Letras en Francia. Ha recibido también el Premio Médicis en Francia, el Premio Chateaubriand, el Premio Mundial 5 del Duca, otorgado por el Institut de France, también en el año 2013. Es doctor honoris causa de las universidades de Neuchâtel, de la Lafayette College, de la Universidad de Bristol, de la Universidad de Warwick, de la Universidad de Bordeaux, de la Universidad de Versalles Saint-Quentin-Yvelines, de la Universidad de París-Sorbona, de St. Andrews University, de la Universidad Colgate, de la Universidad de Yale y de la Universidad de Buenos Aires. Autor de numerosos libros y artículos sobre la historia del libro, de la lectura y de la cultura escrita universal. Es una fuente obligatoria de lectura para todo aquel que se interesa en las ciencias de la información y en la historia de la cultura escrita. Le agradecemos muy particularmente el tiempo que ha podido tomar para participar como orador en este ciclo. Robert, if you want to take your time now.
Well, thank you so much. I'm delighted. I'm honored to be part of this conference and in discussion with my good friend Michael Suarez. I've spent many happy days in Buenos Aires and love Argentina. So special greetings to my Argentinian friends. I must say that I absolutely agree with the eloquent points made by Michael. During my work as the head of the Harvard University Library, my main goal was to open up this gigantic collection, the largest university library in the world, to people outside of Harvard and to democratize access to learning, largely through digital techniques. Still, what I'd like to say today is something quite different from that, because it could be that many of the people listening right now have never set foot into a rare book room or are teaching people who have never set foot in rare book rooms. And that can be an intimidating experience. So you could ask, what are rare book rooms for? Are they only a kind of playground for the wealthy elite? Well, let me try to answer that question. And the short answer would be rare book rooms and rare books can help us understand what literature is and how it happens. What I'd like to do would be to illustrate that point by just drawing on some of my personal experiences. So if you will indulge me, I'll talk about some of the experiences I've had, first of all, as a student. I was an undergraduate, just arrived at Harvard in 1957, a long time ago, and I heard a rumor that undergraduates were allowed in the rare book library. I also heard that the library possessed a book that had once been owned by one of my heroes, Herman Melville. It was a book of Emerson's essays that Melville read and annotated. So I took my courage in my hands and I went into the rare book library and I said, could I possibly see Melville's copy of Emerson's essays? Well, in a few minutes, it was sitting on the desk in front of me. I was simply amazed. And so I began reading Emerson, trying to imagine Melville reading Emerson, to read these famous essays. I don't know how well known Emerson is in Argentina, but he's big stuff in the USA. I was trying to read Emerson through the eyes of Melville. And I came upon an essay of Emerson's called Prudence. In it, Emerson was describing what he called the world soul and how, from that perspective, suffering, unhappiness really isn't terribly important, even in the roughest places. For example, Cape Horn, which has the roughest waters in the world, as you well know, in Argentina. Well, next to that passage, Melville put a big X, and then at the bottom of the page, he wrote another X, and he said, to someone who has rounded Cape Horn as a common sailor, what stuff this is. It was fabulous. You could see, this rough and ready, more or less man of the people, common sailor, great novelist, taking a certain distance from the grand philosopher. And that experience you can only have in a great library that happens to possess a copy of the essays of Emerson, read by Herman Melville. Another example of the experience you can have in rare books that I came across was in a rare book room where I was reading what the French call, as you know, Susana, roman à clé. So a roman à clé is a novel in which the fictional characters stand for real people. And part of the amusement in reading a novel of this kind is to figure out who the real people are. Well, I was reading a copy of a novel called Zéokinizule, which was the first novel about the sex life of Louis XV. In the back of it, there was a key to these characters written in manuscript by an 18th century reader. And so I was able to follow the key, reading the novel, and because I'd done a lot of research on Louis XV, I could actually see where the reader had made some mistakes. So it was a fascinating experience of being able to reconstruct the actual act of reading 250 years ago, and to see how a contemporary of Louis XV had decoded a key text. So again, that's the kind of thing that you can do in a rare book room that you can't do anywhere else. Another example, now not so much from the consumption end of literature, that is reading, but from the productive end, the actual printing of books. This other example I experienced in a rare book room where there was a copy of an inexpensive 18th century edition of the Encyclopédie of Diderot and d'Alembert, the Bible, so to speak, of the Enlightenment, which I was studying from manuscript sources. Well, I noticed in one copy that there was a huge thumbprint, a very clear thumbprint, half of which disappeared into the binding. That meant the thumbprint had to be made by one of the printers of the book when he was printing the sheet that was later bound. So I went to the record of the foreman of the bookshop, the printing shop, and I found out that the man who had printed that particular sheet was called Bonne-Main. It was a nickname. And in fact, I was able to reconstruct a good bit of his career. I mean, he's a worker from the 18th century, people who normally don't appear at all in history. It turned out that he was a Norman. He had dark hair. He did his training as a printer in Paris. He then went on a tour de France. That is, he tramped, he walked from place to place. He arrived in Lyon, where he fell in with a family called the Compolin, a father, a mother, and a grown-up son. And then he took to tramping with them to other cities, picking up jobs in printing shops. When he got to the city of Dole in the Franche-Comté, they got into trouble with a master printer. They had a big fight and they ran off, throwing half-printed sheets on the floor. They arrived nearby in Neuchâtel, where they were hired and where I found the records. Then it turned out that this fellow, Bonne-Main, stayed there for nearly 2 years, and I could identify every single book he published. So what I'm saying again is, behind the physical object, you could see a life. You could get some sense of the tenor of existence of the people who actually made books. Well, to go from that example to the example of another famous book, Gutenberg's Bible, I could tell you about the experience of actually using the Bible to teach. We have a copy at Harvard, and when I would give seminars on the history of books, I would arrive with Gutenberg's Bible, put it on the desk. It's in 2 volumes. One volume would be on display, but I could use the other volume for teaching purposes. And the students would sit back in amazement at this precious book. But then I would ask them, well, turn the pages. Tell me what it feels like. And they began actually thumbing through Gutenberg's Bible, which is a very tough book. They weren't hurting it at all. And then I began to ask questions such as, what do you think of the pagination? And then they noticed there was no pagination. Why not? Or I asked, why are the hand-painted letters larger here and smaller there? What do the physical aspects of this tell you about it? And as often I would have a rare book librarian surround Gutenberg's Bible with contemporary manuscript Bibles. And then it occurred to the students that what Gutenberg was doing was to try to imitate as well as he could a manuscript. And that has to do with a famous argument made by one of the founders of book history, Lucien Febvre, that in his original phrase, le livre retarde. Books slow down. The invention of printing, far from being progressive, was regressive because it was perpetuating antiquated ways of organizing the text. Well, whether you believe it or not, I don't actually. You can look at the Bible as something that, of course, has evolved over time as a text, and that you can only do in rare book rooms. North Americans often use the expression to cite chapter and verse. I don't know if you can say that in Spanish, but it's very important for the popular culture, if you like, of estadounidenses. But the early Bibles didn't have verses at all, nor did they have chapters. The first chapters appear, or the first chapters in the 13th century. And then the first time the Bible is divided into not just chapters, but also verses, happens in 1551, when a great printer, Robert Etienne, who had taken refuge with Calvin in Geneva, actually broke the text up into verses. Well, to read a text which is divided into chapters and verses is a very different experience from reading it right through in its original, one of its original fluid states. And in fact, a lot of people read the Bible just for a particular verse and cite it by heart. So they detextualize it in a fairly radical way. A final example would be dealing with what you could call more ordinary books in rare book rooms, because rare books rooms don't just collect the most famous objects like the Gutenberg Bible, but they collect all kinds of things, including ephemera and inexpensive editions, which I think are particularly revealing. Recently, I've just completed a book about pirating books. In the 18th century, I found, somewhat to my surprise, that most books that were sold during the 50 years before the French Revolution were pirated. And by most, I mean more than half, probably close to 3/4 of the books. One contemporary estimate was that there were in bookstores around 1780, 30 million pirated books, more than the whole population of adults or population of France. So France was overwhelmed with pirated books. And to understand French culture, I think you need to look at the pirated books as well as the famous first editions. And if you do look at them, you find the elimination of what publishers in those days called luxe typographique, typographical luxury. In fact, the Parisian publishers of the original books produced wonderful works on very expensive paper with a great deal of white showing in the actual mise en page or design of the pages. They were expensive, but the pirates, they were looking for a different kind of public. So they eliminated typographical luxury, and instead they crushed the text together. They sometimes cut whole passages. They were trying to satisfy a down market public. And if you look at a pirated edition compared with the fancy Paris edition, what you can perceive is a process, the beginning of the opening up of literature to a general public. And that's a long, complicated story, but the physical book can make it possible for you to see this and to actually get some inside sense of the process itself. So I would argue that the rare books are very important, not just as treasures, but for understanding literature, to understand the way literature came into being and the way it was experienced by people. So I say, long live rare book rooms, but of course, long live the access to them and the process of democratization of that access that Michael described.
Thank you very, very, very much. It was really delightful to hear this presentation. Muchísimas gracias por estas dos magníficas conferencias. Creo que ha sido la mejor manera de terminar este ciclo de conferencias. Thank you very much to all of you, because this presentation, I think, invite us, your two presentations, invite us to analyze one of the challenges of the existence of rare books and digital collections too, which is certainly one of the most important questions at the present time, to analyze the place of heritage collections, not only in the cultural life and the historical point of view, but even in political, economical, and social point of view in our societies. In Europe, it's a very important challenge, this point. We call about citizen science now, and we develop the study of the poétique des supports, the material poetics of books, which increasingly takes into account the material history of books in literary studies in particular. So it's really interesting to hear your presentations. My question to Michael, you spoke about working with communities in the United States and special programs to promote access to digital heritage collections. But I'm thinking it's just a way to work on special communities' culture, or it is used also to a way to reaching a common identity in the United States in this critical time.
Yes, I think that it is a way both to find a way to preserve and to prize and to mediate particular stories and particular experiences of communities that have typically been marginalized. But I also think that that builds a bridge into the Special Collections Library and says, you know, your story is important for all of us and we value it, but there are all these other stories too here, and we want you to participate in that. So I think that what you suggest is absolutely right. On the one hand, it's important for the community and its own separate identity. But on the other hand, it does create a bridge, or if you will, a kind of a ligature to say this Special Collections Library holds our story, the story of my father, the story of my grandmother, and there are other stories here, and I could learn how to attend to those, and we could all enlarge our humanity together. And I think that just what Bob Darnton says is exactly right, that these Special Collections Libraries are ultimately about the enlargement of our human sensibilities, and to understand not just objects frozen in time, but human processes and human stories. I think Bob and I would both say that we were resolute humanists and very committed to the humanistic enterprise. And one of the sites for that is a Special Collections Library, but a Special Collections Library that's more open and more welcoming, and that has collections that are more authentically representative.
Could I put in a word
Yes.
here, Susana? One of the problems of special collections is that they seem so far removed from ordinary people. They seem to exist in an elite world that is cut off from the general public. And what we need, I believe, is to make it possible for the public to benefit from these treasures. But it's not easy, and the word has to get out. And furthermore, we can pronounce the importance of openness, but libraries have often been very closed. In fact, they've been reserved for the privileged elite. And in the case of the United States, there have been some shameful moments. For example, the great African-American writer Richard Wright went to a library in Tennessee, it was, to get a book and was told, no, Black people can't have books here. But he really wanted that book. So he came back another day and said he was fetching it for a white man, and they gave it to him. So yes, libraries can seem exclusive. They can be exclusive. They can be intimidating to normal people. And part of the challenge, I think, of rare book libraries is that they are the most exclusive part of the exclusive world of libraries. So we need ways of overcoming that exclusivity. And certainly, as Michael said, expanding collections so that they have material that relates to the actual experience of minorities, different ethnic groups, and so on, is one route to take.
Yes, of course. It's a very different condition in Europe, maybe. The situation is maybe different in Europe with rare books places and libraries.
Yes, I agree. But how many people from the banlieue in the north of Paris have ever been inside the Biblioteca Nacional?
You are right. It is because now the point is to develop citizen science, to open the doors and to libraries and to laboratories and to even universities, to people, to diffuse this kind of literature and to show to these people that this culture is their culture too, is their history too, and that's the point. Very difficult to get, and that was my question, because your presentation is really a personal presentation, and it reminded me my own emotion discovering the books read and annotated by Voltaire. It was a personal experience, incredible experience, and the kind of work we made when we work with clandestine manuscripts, because we need to see, to touch the paper to understand this kind of literature. But the fact is, many people have not access to this kind of collections because this kind of libraries is not present in all the cities. And maybe in Argentina, they have not access to this kind of books. There is other kind of collections, that's right, but not this one where you are talking about. So what do you think about digital collections? Do you think we can work in the same way or in the different way? And what is your opinion on that?
You're asking me, Susan?
Yes.
Susana? Well, in 2011, I invited some heads of foundations, some heads of libraries, and some computer scientists to Harvard to discuss a proposition. And the proposition was, could we link up all of the digitized holdings of the research libraries of the United States in one system and make it available free to the entire country and indeed the entire world? It seemed extravagant, but the idea was to out-Google Google, because Google was trying to do this, but to charge money for it.
Yes.
In fact, Google was developing a commercial monopoly of access to digitized knowledge. And a New York court declared Google's project, called Google Book Search, a violation of the Anti-Monopoly Sherman Antitrust Act. So we tried to, as I say, out-Google Google by creating a free digital public library of America. 2 years later,
maybe like the Europeana library,
just like the Europeana library. And in fact, we designed the infrastructure of the digital public library of America to be compatible with the infrastructure of Europeana. As you probably know, Europeana has problems because it has a very complicated governing body, or several governing bodies, and it gets its money from the EU, which is not paying enough. Still, the idea is to link up this Digital Public Library of America with Europeana and other such projects, and to create a universal library. I think we will have a world digital library within 10 years. However, I am a great fan of one of the Argentine writers that everyone knows well, Borges. And Borges warns us that this utopian dream of access to all books can turn into a nightmare. If you read the Library of Babel, it is a dystopia. Or another of his stories, the Libro de Arena, in which there is a book that contains all books in the world, and it's such a burden for the man who acquires it that he sneaks into the National Library of Buenos Aires and hides it in a shelf. So it's there somewhere. Maybe some of the people at this conference can find it, but look out, because Borges says it will drive you crazy.
I am thinking just in Borges' Biblioteca, the nightmare of this magnificent Biblioteca Universal. But no, I was interested in your answer, because we have a problem when we work on this kind of subject. It's different economic model of digital libraries, and sometimes it's very difficult to access for researchers in countries like Argentina to some libraries, because it's a private system, very expensive system. So I was interested in your answer about this point. It's very interesting for us. Thank you very, very much. You will have some questions on the chat, and I think next week for the last presentation of your conference. Thank you very, very much to join us for this webinar. And I hope we will meet in real life next time, maybe in Buenos Aires or in Virginia, or maybe in Paris, if you can come here and have another conversation like that. Thank you. Muchísimas gracias por la participación.
Adiós.
Agradecemos entonces la valiosa y generosa presencia de Robert Darnton y de Michael Suarez en este ciclo, que le ha aportado junto con los otros oradores distinción y calidad académica. Ha sido realmente un honor contar con su participación en el día de hoy. Te darán algunos minutos para que se hagan consultas y comentarios en el chat, y luego tendremos el cierre formal del ciclo de conferencias internacionales de la Biblioteca Nacional Mariano Moreno, las colecciones bibliográficas de especiales, diferentes miradas. Muchas gracias.
Llegando al final de este soñado ciclo de conferencias internacionales, agradecemos a las autoridades actuales de la Biblioteca Nacional Mariano Moreno por haber impulsado este espacio. Agradecemos la generosidad y maestría de todos y cada uno de los expositores. Agradecemos la presencia de ustedes, como público comprometido con la temática. Nosotros, los profesionales de la información y las personas ligadas a bibliotecas con colecciones especiales, no sabemos guardianes de estos tesoros. Es importante creer que realmente está en nosotros la posibilidad de hacer que sobreviva la memoria escrita del pasado para el futuro de nuestros pueblos. Y es el conocimiento sobre estos temas lo que nos dará el apoyo necesario para concretarlo. Celebramos este y los espacios de formación y divulgación en los cuales podamos crear relaciones profesionales, ampliar nuestros horizontes y colaborar a la concientización de la sociedad de la que formamos parte. Agradecemos el trabajo del equipo técnico, del equipo de sistemas, del equipo de diseño y corrección, de Romina Montuori-Yulán y Eugenia Santana Goitia en la traducción. La Biblioteca Nacional Mariano Moreno les ofrece un hasta luego y los invita a participar, por otra parte, del 5º Encuentro Nacional de Instituciones con Fondos Antiguos y Raros y del Encuentro Nacional de Catalogadores a realizarse durante el año 2021. Muchas gracias.